Her eyes told me everything long before her lips ever spoke a word. It wasn't the kind of look you give someone casually, or the kind that passes unnoticed in a crowded room. It was heavier, softer, and yet it carried the quiet weight of unspoken truths. I remember the first time I met her, how her gaze lingered just a second too long, and how in that silence, something inside me stirred. It felt like recognition, as if a hidden part of myself had been waiting for that exact moment, for that exact person. There was no grand announcement, no sudden revelation, just a simple meeting of eyes that unraveled years of carefully folded feelings I hadn't dared to explore. Her presence was gentle but undeniable, like the way sunlight sneaks through the curtains at dawn, refusing to be ignored. I felt seen, in a way that both terrified and comforted me, like she had touched the most fragile parts of my heart without ever lifting a hand. It was in the way her eyes softened when she listened, the way they brightened when I laughed, and the way they silently reached for me when I was too afraid to speak. They told me stories of her own longing, of nights she had spent wondering if love like this could ever be real, of fears she hid behind her smile. And in them, I found my own reflection, raw and unguarded. That look became the beginning of everything, before the words, before the confessions, before the world knew what lived between us. It was the secret language we shared, a conversation carried without sound, a bond that deepened with every glance. Our friendship grew quietly, wrapped in shared coffees and long walks, in the comfort of her shoulder brushing mine when neither of us dared to move away. The world around us remained unaware, but in those moments, her eyes spoke with an honesty that words could never match. There was one evening, under a sky scattered with stars, when I caught her staring at me like I was the only person in the universe. My breath caught, my heart stumbled, and for the first time, I realized love could be this simple, two souls meeting halfway without needing permission. When the words finally came, they were small and trembling. She whispered that she had been afraid to tell me, afraid of what it could mean, of what we might lose. But I already knew, because her eyes had been confessing to me long before her lips ever did. I took her hand, and for the first time, I let my own gaze answer back with the truth I had carried in silence. From that night forward, nothing was the same. The world remained complicated, but within her eyes I always found my home, a place where love was both fragile and infinite. And even now, when words fail me, I only have to look at her to remember. Her eyes told me everything, and I listened. She walked into the room with laughter trailing behind her, the kind of sound that carried warmth and lit up corners no lamp could reach. It was not just the sound, but the way her presence changed the rhythm of everything around her, like even time itself leaned closer to listen. I hadn't expected her, hadn't been waiting, but the moment our eyes met across that crowded space, the noise of the world softened. It felt as though the chatter, the clinking glasses, and even my restless thoughts stepped aside to make room for the stillness she brought me. It wasn't love at first sight, not the kind people romanticize, but something gentler, quieter, an unspoken recognition, as if two souls had just remembered each other. I held her gaze longer than I should have, and in that pause I felt a story begin, even if I didn't yet know the words. I caught myself watching her when I thought she wouldn't notice, tracing the way her smile seemed to belong to everyone yet somehow carried a secret I longed to uncover. She moved through conversations like music, fluid and natural, and yet, when her eyes found mine again, it felt like the world had drawn an invisible thread between us. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into the silence, but the truth pressed quietly against my ribs. I wanted to know her, not in fragments, not in passing, but in all the little ways that people keep hidden. I I wanted to know the shape of her laughter when it wasn't shared with a crowd, the way her voice softened when the night grew quiet, and the things she whispered only to herself when no one was listening. When she finally walked toward me, the room seemed to tilt just slightly. Every step felt unhurried, but deliberate, as if she too had felt the pull. She said hello, and though it was the simplest word, my heart heard it like a beginning. The conversation stumbled at first, two strangers pretending not to feel the weight of the air between them, but soon words flowed, carried by a rhythm neither of us tried to control. I learned that she loved the rain but hated umbrellas, that she carried books in her bag as though stories were talismans, that she had a scar on her hand from climbing a tree when she was 8. Each detail was small, ordinary even, but together they painted something extraordinary. The night stretched on, yet I found myself wishing time would slow its hands. When she laughed at something I said, I wanted to bottle the sound and keep it with me. When she brushed a strand of hair from her face, I wished I could reach out and tuck it behind her ear. And when she looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold both questions and answers, I knew this was not just a passing moment. It was the first page of something I hadn't dared to dream, a story that began with a glance and whispered promises of everything still to come. Across the crowded hall, the world felt noisy, filled with footsteps, laughter, and scattered voices bouncing off the walls. Yet for them, everything else dissolved into silence. Their eyes met again, pulled together by something unseen, something neither could name but both felt deeply. It wasn't chance, not anymore. It was as if an invisible thread had drawn them back into this moment, and neither dared to look away. No words passed between them, but none were needed. In that instant, silence became a language of its own, and it carried more weight than sentences ever could. Her gaze softened, almost shy, yet filled with a warmth that spread across the space like a quiet embrace. She wanted to smile but stopped halfway, afraid that revealing too much might shatter the fragile stillness holding them together. And yet, in her hesitation, there was truth. The hall around them blurred. People moved, laughed, and brushed by, but faces became indistinct shapes, voices melted into background hums. The only reality was the unspoken conversation between two souls daring to meet without sound. Their eyes held questions, answers, and confessions, curiosity tinged with tenderness, longing disguised as fleeting glances, and a vulnerability that asked softly, "Do you feel this too?" Each second stretched longer than it should have, turning into something eternal. She felt her heart drum steadily, not with fear, but with recognition, as though she was being reminded of something she had always known. For the first time, she allowed herself to be seen, really seen, and she found no judgment there, only a reflection of the same fragile courage. Silent conversations poured between them. Every glance was a phrase. Every heartbeat was a reply. She wanted to close the distance, to step forward and break the invisible wall, but there was something sacred in holding back, in letting silence do what words could not. Sometimes, stillness holds more meaning than action, and she knew this moment was too delicate to rush. She stayed where she was, and in that choice, trust quietly bloomed. The silence was not empty. It was full, overflowing with emotions they didn't yet have names for. It carried promises that one day would be spoken, dreams that hadn't yet formed, and a recognition that life had shifted in a subtle, irreversible way. It was not the beginning of a story told aloud, but of one whispered in glances, nurtured in pauses, and built on the invisible rhythm of two hearts daring to listen to each other. When the crowd finally moved them apart, their eyes lingered until the last possible second, stretching that invisible thread as far as it would go. And though the hall reclaimed its noise, both carried the silence inside them like a secret gift. Because sometimes, love begins not in words, but in the quiet spaces where hearts learn to understand each other without ever speaking. A smile over coffee, a hand brushing past, her gaze lingering longer than it should, these fleeting details wove themselves into the quiet rhythm of their days, becoming the soft pulse of something unspoken. She often wondered how ordinary moments could carry so much weight, how the steam rising from a simple mug could feel like an invitation, how laughter over something silly could echo in her heart long after it faded. It wasn't grand or dramatic, it was subtle, almost fragile, like sunlight slipping through half-closed blinds. Yet every glance, every accidental touch, every pause carried a tenderness that spoke louder than words ever could. When their fingers brushed, it felt like electricity, not harsh or shocking, but warm, steady, alive, something that lingered in her veins long after. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, coincidence, but deep down she knew it wasn't. There was intention in the way her hand didn't move away quickly, in the way her gaze held just a second too long, in the way her smile curved differently when it was meant only for her. It became their secret language, unspoken but deeply felt, stitched into the ordinary rituals of everyday life. Coffee breaks became something sacred, not because of the drink, but because of who sat across the table, who leaned in a little closer, who let the silence stretch comfortably without the need to fill it. She memorized the smallest things. The way her laugh began softly and then burst out uncontained. The way her hair fell into her eyes when she tilted her head. The way her lips parted as if holding back words that never quite escaped. Sometimes she wondered if others could see it too, if the world noticed the invisible thread pulling them toward each other, quiet yet unbreakable. And sometimes, in her boldest moments, she imagined what it would be like to cross the line between almost uncertainty, to replace lingering gazes with a confession, to step into the unknown with both feet. But for now, it was enough to exist here, in this delicate balance of closeness and restraint, where the smallest gestures carried oceans of meaning. Time always seemed slower with her, as if the universe conspired to stretch seconds into something infinite, gifting them space to breathe and notice, to feel without saying. And maybe that was the beauty of it, that love did not need fireworks or declarations, that it could be found in a quiet room, in a half smile, in a touch that lingered. She realized love could bloom softly, secretly, asking only to be seen and cherished. And though unspoken, it was real, undeniable, alive within them, shimmering in the silence they shared. A smile over coffee, a hand brushing past, her gaze lingering longer than it should. Small, fleeting, yet enough to fill an entire world. One evening, the silence between them grew so heavy it seemed as though even the air was holding its breath. For so long, she had rehearsed the words in her mind, yet every time they tried to escape, fear would drag them back into hiding. But tonight was different. Tonight, courage rose above doubt, and for the first time she felt strong enough to let her heart speak. Her gaze lingered on the girl beside her, the girl whose laughter had been her favorite melody, whose presence had turned even the darkest days into something worth enduring. Friendship had always been their shield, their safety, their carefully built boundary, but beneath it lived an ocean of emotions neither of them dared to name. Every glance, every brush of fingertips, every moment of silence charged with meaning, it had all been real, yet never spoken aloud. Her chest ached with the weight of it, and finally, with a shaky breath, she let go. "I've always felt it too," she whispered, the words trembling but true, carrying years of hidden longing within them. The pause that followed was unbearable, stretching wide and fragile, threatening to break her apart. But then, her eyes lifted and met hers, glistening brimming with tears, not of fear but of recognition, of relief, of love that had waited just as patiently. In that instant, the world seemed to soften, and everything that once felt impossible became clear. It wasn't just her, she had never been alone in this. Every secret smile, every lingering silence, every moment of closeness had been shared. She reached out with hesitant hands, and this time, when their fingers found each other, there was no pulling away. That touch was electric yet grounding, a promise spoken without words. It wasn't fireworks or grand gestures, it was something quieter, deeper, something that settled into the soul with a certainty no one could take away. Memories rushed through her mind. The way their shoulders brushed when they walked too close, the nights spent talking about everything and nothing, the comfort of simply existing together. All of it, every piece, had led to this moment. Tears spilled, but they were sweet, carrying away the fear, the doubt, the endless waiting. She felt lighter, freer, as though she had finally stepped into the truth of who she was and who they could be. The confession didn't need explanations or apologies, it was enough. It was everything. Their story had always been there, woven quietly between words unspoken, and now it was finally written in the open. They sat together in the warmth of their shared silence, hearts beating in rhythm, smiles trembling with the joy of finally being understood. Outside, the night continued as though nothing had changed, but inside, everything had shifted forever. What began as a fragile whisper became the strongest truth they had ever known. That love had always been here, waiting, and at last, it no longer needed to hide. Doubts crept in like uninvited shadows, silent but heavy, making each moment feel fragile, as though the slightest shift could shatter everything. She sat across from me, her presence both comforting and terrifying, because every glance from her eyes carried a weight I couldn't ignore. They weren't just eyes, they were a language, one I had learned to understand quietly over time, though it was never spoken aloud. Fear lingered between us, fear of being seen for what we were, for what I felt, for what she might feel too. Judgment loomed like an invisible wall around us, one built by the world, by expectations, by the unspoken rules of who we were allowed to love. Yet, even with that fear pressing against my chest, those eyes, gentle, unwavering, and impossibly honest, kept whispering truths that her lips dared not say. It was in the way her gaze softened when mine faltered, in the way she lingered just a moment too long, as though memorizing something she wasn't supposed to. I wondered if she knew what it did to me, how it dismantled the barriers I worked so hard to hold up. I told myself not to read too much into it, that maybe I was only wishing, only projecting my own hidden feelings onto her silence. But then, in the quiet spaces where words would have been too loud, her eyes spoke for her, telling me that I wasn't alone in this storm of longing and uncertainty. The world outside might never understand us. It might never forgive us for daring to love differently, for breaking the fragile mold of expectations. But here, in this stolen moment, in this fragile silence, none of that mattered. Her eyes didn't carry doubt. They carried something braver, an unspoken confession, a hope she was too afraid to voice. And though I felt fear claw at me, I also felt something else, something stronger, something that pulled me closer without either of us moving. It was the quietest kind of truth, the kind that doesn't need words because it exists in every glance, every heartbeat, every breath caught between two people who are too afraid to say it but too powerless to deny it. And as I sat there, caught between fear and desire, I realized that love doesn't always need to be spoken to be real. Sometimes, it lives in hidden places, in stolen glances, in the silence that feels louder than words. Sometimes, it hides in the fear of judgment, in the doubt that gnaws at you, yet it survives anyway, stubborn and unyielding. Her eyes told me everything, everything her lips could not. They told me of love waiting patiently, quietly, courageously. And though I may never know when or how those words will finally find their way past fear, I know this, our hearts have already spoken, and no amount of silence can ever erase what her eyes have already confessed. The room was quiet, yet it felt full, as if the air itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for this moment. She sat across from her, a small distance that suddenly felt vast, the weight of unspoken words pressing down like the gravity of the universe. Every glance, every stolen look over the weeks had been a language they alone understood, a silent conversation that no one else could hear. Her fingers twitched unconsciously on her lap, and she noticed a smile tugging at the corners of her lips, delicate but full of promise. The hesitation lingered, fragile and tender, until finally, she reached out, her hand bridging the gap, trembling with anticipation. Their fingers met, slowly, intentionally, as if testing the waters of something vast and uncharted, and the moment felt suspended, infinite in its simplicity. There was no need for words, her eyes, wide and shining, spoke the sentences she had longed to hear, a confession of fear, longing, and finally, acceptance. The warmth of her touch traveled through them both, igniting something quiet yet unstoppable, a current of feeling that had existed long before either had dared to name it. Memories of small gestures, lingering touches, and soft laughter came rushing back, each one a thread weaving them closer together, until the present felt like a natural unfolding of everything they had always been too shy or too careful to acknowledge. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, a steady drum that matched the rhythm of the others, as if the world itself had slowed to accommodate the tender symmetry between them. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to lift years of weight from her shoulders, and the other leaned in, smiling with a shyness that made the entire room blush. When their lips finally met, it was gentle, exploratory, like a question finally answered, a promise finally made tangible. Time folded in on itself, and the space between them disappeared, leaving only warmth, understanding, and the unspoken vow that neither would ever let this slip away again. Love, long restrained and quietly nurtured, began to unfurl in its own deliberate, unhurried way, reaching into every corner of their beings, coloring their world in shades they hadn't even realized existed. And in that perfect, ordinary, extraordinary moment, everything they had kept hidden, every doubt and every longing, transformed into something palpable, something they could hold on to in the certainty of each other's gaze. It was not just a beginning but a homecoming, a quiet surrender to the truth that had always been there, waiting patiently in the shadows of smiles and lingering glances. Hands intertwined, hearts aligned, and in the simple, unspoken understanding that they were finally together, love began, not loud or frantic, but steady, radiant, and profoundly alive. And so, as the night unfolded in its quiet stillness, I found myself caught between the soft hum of silence and the unshakable truth that her eyes had already spoken long before her lips ever tried. They carried entire conversations in the smallest glances, stories written without ink, and promises bound without words. I had always believed that love would need to be shouted, declared boldly into the world to make it real, but she taught me that sometimes the deepest truths live in silence, in the language that only hearts can translate. In her gaze I saw the fragments of her courage, the scars of her battles, the beauty of her resilience, and the tenderness she never thought she was allowed to give away. I didn't need her to say she loved me, it was already there, tucked into the way her eyes softened when she saw me laugh, the way they lingered when I drifted into thought, the way they searched for me even in a crowded room as if I were the only anchor she had ever trusted. Loving her felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years, like watching light break through after too many nights of endless storm. It was not the kind of love that asked me to be perfect, nor the kind that demanded we fit into the expectations of others. It was the kind that held me in my most fragile hours and reminded me that I was enough, that we were enough, exactly as we were. And maybe that is why her eyes meant everything, because they didn't just see me, they believed in me, they believed in us, even when doubt threatened to pull us apart. I realized then that our love did not need approval, it did not need validation from anyone beyond ourselves. It simply needed to be lived, nurtured, and cherished with every breath we took together. So I let go of the fear, of the weight of what-ifs and maybes, and I let myself fall fully into the truth that had been there all along. Her eyes had already told me that I was home, that I was safe, that I was loved in a way that could withstand storms, silence, and time itself. And as I leaned into that love, letting it wrap around me like a gentle dawn after the longest night, I knew with absolute certainty that no matter where the world tried to place us, no matter how many roads turned uncertain, her eyes would always guide me back. Because in them lived not just the reflection of who we were, but the future of who we could become together, a love unhidden, unwavering, and unafraid. And in that truth, I finally found the forever I had been searching for.